The year was 1881, and the high desert wind carried nothing but dust and the smell of alkali. Caleb Hart rode into Cedar Bluff on a horse that favored its left foreleg, a creature as worn and spent as its rider. He had nothing to his name but the horse, the Winchester rifle in its scabbard, and the clothes on his back, rags that barely covered the fading gray of a Confederate coat. The war had ended 16 years ago, but for Caleb, it had never stopped. It lived in the hollows of his eyes, in the tight set of his jaw, and in the way his left hand hovered near the worn butt of his pistol. He had come west, like so many others, to erase a past that was burned into him. Tennessee, the smoke, the screaming of his younger brother as he fell near Shiloh. It was all a fever dream that the dry, empty expanse of the territories was supposed to cure. But the West was not empty. It was just a different kind of crowded. Cedar Bluff was a wound in the earth, a collection of raw lumber and adobe buildings huddled against the wind. Men watched him as he dismounted, their gazes lingering on his coat, on the scar that cut from his temple to his chin. He was a stranger, and in towns like this, a stranger was just trouble that had not yet found its name. He led his horse to the trough, pumping the handle until clean water spilled over the wooden rim. He ignored the eyes, ignored the sudden quiet that fell over the boardwalk. He needed two things, grain for his horse and whiskey for himself, inside the Dry Gulch saloon. The air was thick with sweat, cheap tobacco, and stale beer. He walked to the bar, dropped 2 coins, and spoke his first words in as many days. Whiskey. The bartender, a heavy man with a stained apron, slid him a cloudy glass. Caleb took it and moved to a table in the darkest corner, his back to the wall. He was a man who understood angles and exits. He drank, the liquor burning a welcome trail down his throat, but it did nothing to warm the cold iron in his gut. The quiet lasted only a minute. A chair scraped against the floorboards. A large man, flushed with drink and importance, blocked the light. He wore the expensive, tooled boots of a man who owned things, likely cattle. "That's a Reb coat," the man said, his voice loud enough to carry. Caleb did not look up. He stared into his glass. "We don't much like Rebs in this town," the man, Silas Croft, continued. He smiled at his friends, enjoying the attention. "Especially silent ones. Cat got your tongue, Johnny?" Caleb took a slow breath. He wanted no part of this. He had seen enough death to fill 10 lifetimes and had no desire to add to the tally. "Leave it be," he said, his voice a low rasp. Croft laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Leave it be? You come into our town, wearing that trader's rag, smelling of the trail, and you tell me to leave it be?" He leaned closer, his shadow falling over Caleb. "I think you're a coward, a mute Reb coward." He reached out and grabbed the lapel of Caleb's coat. It was a mistake. Caleb did not move with the sloppy aggression of a drunk. He moved with the honed, desperate efficiency of a man who had fought in trenches. He did not go for his gun. He kicked the table leg sideways, knocking Croft off balance. As the rancher stumbled, Caleb rose, driving the heel of his hand up under Croft's chin. The man's head snapped back with a crack of teeth. Croft bellowed in rage and swung a fist as big as a ham. Caleb ducked under it, grabbed the half-empty whiskey bottle from the table, and brought it down hard on the rancher's forearm. The bottle shattered. Croft roared in pain, clutching his arm. Before Croft's friends could stand, Caleb had his pistol out, not aimed, but held low and steady. The saloon went dead silent. The only sound, Croft's pained breathing. "I'm done here," Caleb said. "You're done when I say you are." A new voice cut in. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway, his own gun drawn and level. Brody was a man who enjoyed the simple authority of his badge. "Drop it, Drifter. Drop it now." Caleb looked at the sheriff, then at the men rising from their tables. He was boxed in, slowly, meticulously. He placed his pistol on the floor and kicked it away. 2 deputies seized his arms, twisting them behind his back with painful force. "He assaulted me," Croft yelled, cradling his bleeding arm. "Tried to kill me." "I see that. Silas," Brody said, holstering his weapon. "We got a cell just for men like him. vagrancy, disturbing the peace, and assault with intent. As they dragged him out into the blinding afternoon sun, Caleb saw her. She was watching from a carriage, a vehicle so fine it seemed out of place in the dusty street. It was black lacquer, drawn by 2 matching black horses. She sat perfectly still, a woman dressed in severe, expensive black wool, no veil, no ornamentation. Her face was pale, beautiful, and as hard as granite. Eleanor Vale. The name was whispered in the saloon, a name that carried the weight of fear and speculation. She was the widow of Judge Vale, the man who had owned half the territory and ruled the other half with an iron fist. Now she owned it all. The town said she was rich. They knew she was unmarried, and they whispered that she had helped the judge to his grave with a dose of strychnine. Her eyes, cold and assessing, met Caleb's. She did not look away, not in pity or curiosity. She watched him as a hawk watches a rabbit, a detached calculation in her gaze. Then, with a slight nod to her driver, the carriage pulled away, leaving Caleb to the mercy of the law. Eleanor Vale did not go home. She directed her driver, Thomas, to the office of Mr. Abernathy, her late husband's lawyer. The office was small, filled with aging leather-bound books that smelled of dust and decaying paper. "Mrs. Vale," Abernathy said, rising nervously. He was a small, fussy man who sweated in all weather. "An unexpected pleasure." "I am not here for pleasure, Mr. Abernathy," Eleanor said, taking a seat without being invited. She did not remove her gloves. "I received this by courier this morning." She placed a thick envelope on his desk. It bore the seal of the territorial court in the capital. Abernathy's face paled as he read. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "Eleanor, Mrs. Vale, this is a most serious development. Spare me the dramatics," she said, her voice flat. "Translate the legal thievery into plain English. Your late husband's cousins, from St. Louis. They have filed a petition," he stammered. "They are challenging your stewardship of the Vale estate." "My stewardship," she repeated. The words were ice. "They argue," Abernathy said, refusing to meet her eyes, "that the Vale Ranch is too vast an enterprise, that the cattle contracts and water rights are too complex for a woman alone to manage. They cite territorial law that, in the absence of a direct male heir, the nearest male relatives may assume control to protect the family's assets from feminine incompetence." Eleanor stared at the wall behind him. Feminine incompetence. She had run the ranch for 5 years while Judge Vale drank himself into a stupor. Negotiated with cattle barons he was too drunk to meet, and saved the entire operation from his gambling debts. She had ridden the lines, paid the men, and built the Vale name into an empire. And now, 2 cousins she had never met were going to take it all because she was a woman. "And they will succeed, won't they?" she asked. It was not a question of defeat, but of fact. Abernathy nodded miserably. "The new territorial judge is a traditionalist. He believes strongly in a structured society. The Vale cousins are well connected, without a legal anchor, a male partner. The court will find in their favor. They will grant the petition. You will lose the ranch." Eleanor stood. The silence in the room was absolute. She thought of her ranch, the only thing she had ever truly loved. The vast, brutal land that was as unforgiving and strong as she was. She would burn it to the ground before she let those eastern vultures take it. "A male partner," she said. "Yes, a husband," Abernathy replied, looking relieved to have finally said it. "If you were married, your husband's name would be joined to yours on the deed. The law recognizes a husband's right to property. The petition would be voided immediately." "I see." She pulled her gloves tighter. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Abernathy." She walked out into the sun, her mind working with cold. Rapid precision, a husband, the thought was repulsive. Marriage, to her, had been a prison of polite cruelty and drunken demands. But losing her land was worse. It was a death. She needed a man, not a partner, but a proxy, not a suitor, but a tool. She needed someone with no ties, no name, and no future. Someone who could not challenge her, and who would be entirely in her debt. Her mind went back to the man being dragged from the saloon, the drifter in the gray coat, the one with the dead eyes and the fast hands, the one the whole town was already condemning. He was perfect. "Tomas," she said to her driver, "take me to the jail." The jail smelled of old sweat, urine, and despair. Sheriff Brody snapped to attention when she entered, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vale, what can I do for you? I've got that drifter locked up tight, the one who attacked Silas." "I am here to see him," she said. "Ma'am, open the cell." It was not a request. Brody, awed by her presence and her wealth, fumbled with his keys and unlocked the heavy iron door. Caleb Hart was lying on a filthy straw-stuffed cot, staring at the ceiling. His knuckles were split and caked with dried blood. He did not sit up when she entered. He just turned his head, his eyes wary. Eleanor Vale stepped into the cell. The sheriff hovered nervously at the door. "Leave us," she commanded. "Ma'am, it ain't safe," Brody protested. "It is safer than standing there wasting my time. Close the door." The sheriff gulped and retreated, pulling the main door of the jail shut, leaving them in the dim light of the cell block. "You," she said, "are in a great deal of trouble." Caleb said nothing. He just watched her. Silas Croft is the nephew of the territorial representative. He is claiming you tried to murder him with a broken bottle. Several of his friends will swear to it. Sheriff Brody will swear to it. You will not get a trial. You will be found guilty and hanged, or perhaps sent to the territorial prison in Yuma. I am told that is a fate worse than hanging. Still, he was silent. His stillness infuriated her, but she did not show it. "You have no money and no friends," she continued. "You are an ex-Confederate in a Union-loyal territory. You are expendable. Get to it, lady." Caleb's voice scraped out. "I doubt you came here to read my fortune." A faint, cold smile touched her lips. "No, I came to make you an offer." She stepped closer, the black wool of her skirt brushing the stone floor. "You have two choices. The first is to stay here and wait for the rope. The second is to marry me." Caleb's expression did not change, but a new light flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, but a deep, bitter amusement. He slowly sat up, his feet hitting the floor. "Marry you? It is a business arrangement," she said sharply, cutting off any mockery. "I have a legal problem. I require a husband to solve it. You are a man with no attachments and a legal problem of your own. I can solve yours." "How?" "Marry me, and I will speak to the judge. The charges against you will be dropped. Silas Croft will be compensated for his injury and his pride. Sheriff Brody will lose his memory. You will be given a place to live, food to eat, and the legal protection of my name. You will want for nothing." Caleb stood, forcing her to look up at him. He was taller than she had realized, and despite his ragged state, he held himself with a straight-backed, dangerous energy. The war was still in him. "And what do you want?" he asked. "In this arrangement, you will be my husband in name, and in name only. You will live at my ranch. You will not interfere in my business. You will not speak to me unless spoken to. You will not, under any circumstances, touch me. You will be a ghost with a wedding ring. In exchange, you will live." Caleb stared at her for a long time. He saw the iron in her spine, the desperation she was trying to hide with arrogance. She was buying him, just as the army had bought him, just as everyone with power had always bought men like him. He had spent the last 16 years wandering, trying to be free of masters. And here was another one, offering him a gilded cage. He let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like rust. "I've been owned before. Lady, I didn't much care for it. I'd rather hang." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She had not expected this. She had expected gratitude, or at least a survivor's cunning. This man's pride was inconvenient. "That is your choice," she said, her voice turning to Flint. "You have 1 hour to reconsider. If I do not hear from you, I will allow the law to take its course." She turned and rapped on the door. Brody let her out. Caleb watched her go, her back perfectly straight, a queen leaving a dungeon. He lay back on the cot, the smell of straw and rot filling his nose. He closed his eyes. Hanging. It would be quick. It would be an end. Maybe it was time. 20 minutes passed. The jail was quiet, save for a drunk snoring in the next cell. Then he heard the jingle of keys. It was not Eleanor. It was Sheriff Brody. He unlocked the cell and sauntered in, a smirk on his face. "Getting comfortable." "Reb?" Brody asked. Caleb didn't answer. "You know," Brody said, walking around the small cell, "we had to inventory your things when we brought you in. It's procedure." He reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver-plated derringer. It was a gambler's gun, small enough to hide in a boot. Caleb's eyes locked onto it. It was not his. Brody walked over to the small, barred window and held the gun up to the light, speaking loudly, as if for an audience. My, a hidden weapon. Looks like you were planning more trouble. This changes things. This ain't just assault anymore. This is attempted murder of a peace officer. That's a fast rope. Hart!" "No trial needed." Brody turned, his smirk widening. He walked to the cell door, placed the derringer on his desk outside the cell, and made a note on a piece of paper. Evidence found on the prisoner, Caleb Hart. He looked back at Caleb. "Mrs. Vale is a powerful woman, but I don't think even she can make this go away. Unless, of course," he tapped the side of his nose, "unless she really wanted to." The sheriff left, locking the cell door behind him. Caleb stood. He walked to the bars and looked at the planted gun. He understood perfectly. Eleanor had not been bluffing. This was the or worse. She was not just offering him a choice. She was showing him he had none. Refuse her, and she would have Brody manufacture a charge that would see him dead by morning. He was expendable. He was trapped. When the hour was nearly up, he heard her boots on the floorboards again. She did not come to his cell. She stood by the sheriff's desk. "Well, Sheriff?" Her voice was clear and cold. Brody spoke. "He's still quiet. Ma'am, stubborn." Caleb gripped the iron bars. His knuckles were white. He had survived Antietam. He had survived Andersonville. He would not be killed by a tin-star sheriff and a planted gun. "Wait," he called out. The talking stopped. Eleanor Vale turned, her face an impassive mask. She walked back to his cell, standing just out of his reach. "I changed my mind," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I accept your offer." Eleanor stared at him, her gaze traveling over his face, searching for any sign of deception. She found only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. "Sheriff," she said, not looking away from Caleb, "it seems there has been a misunderstanding. Mr. Hart is my guest. He will be released into my custody." "But Mrs. Vale," Brody sputtered. "The charges, Silas, the gun. Silas Croft will receive $500 for his trouble." "And you," she said, finally turning to the sheriff, "will realize you made a mistake. That derringer is yours. You must have dropped it. Be more careful." Brody's face went from confused to terrified to compliant in a matter of seconds. "Yes, ma'am. Of course, ma'am. A mistake. My mistake." "See that it is," Eleanor said. "We will be going to the courthouse. Find Judge Hemlock. Tell him he is needed for a wedding." The wedding was the coldest ceremony Caleb had ever witnessed. Judge Hemlock, roused from his afternoon nap, officiated in his chambers, which smelled of stale cigar smoke and old law. Caleb stood in his same trail-worn, bloody clothes. Eleanor stood beside him, a pillar of black wool, her driver. Thomas and a bewildered Sheriff Brody served as the witnesses. The judge read the words quickly, his voice a monotone drone. Caleb said, "I do," when prompted. Eleanor's "I do" was as sharp and final as a closing door. "By the power vested in me by the territory," Hemlock said, "I pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. There were no congratulations. Eleanor signed the certificate, her signature a bold, angry slash. Caleb took the pen and signed Caleb Hart beneath it. It was the first time in 5 years he had written his full name. "It is done," Eleanor said. She turned to Caleb. "My horse is outside. Yours is at the livery. Thomas has already paid the bill." She walked out of the courthouse. Caleb followed, stepping out into the late afternoon light. A married man. He felt no different, only heavier. He retrieved his horse, which looked better for the grain and water, and mounted. Eleanor was already on her black mare, sitting astride, not side saddle. She looked at him, her new husband. "The ranch is 5 miles north of town," she said. "Keep up." She spurred her horse into a steady canter, not looking back to see if he was following. Caleb Hart, a legal ghost, kicked his horse forward, riding behind her. They rode through the high street of Cedar Bluff, past the saloon, past the whispers of the townsfolk who watched the strange procession. By the time the sun was bleeding red over the western canyons, they reached the gates of the Vale Ranch. It was not a ranch house. It was a fortress. A high adobe wall, at least 10 feet tall, surrounded the main compound. Heavy wooden gates were manned by 2 vaqueros holding rifles, their face hard and watchful. They recognized Eleanor and swung the gates open. Caleb rode in behind her. The courtyard was vast, a hive of activity. Even at dusk, men were tending to horses, sharpening tools, and moving supplies. They all stopped to watch their mistress and the stranger who rode with her. Eleanor dismounted, throwing her reins to a young boy. She walked to the center of the yard and turned to Caleb as he swung down from his horse. The air was cold, the tension thick enough to cut. "This is your home now, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet. "But make no mistake, you are my husband, but you are nothing more. Your rooms are in the east wing, separate from mine. Thomas will show you. You will be given work, or you will stay out of the way. Do not interfere with my men. Do not interfere with my business, and do not ever cross the threshold of the main house without my permission." She looked at him. One last, cold assessment. "Welcome to the Vale Ranch." She turned, her boots crunching on the gravel, and walked up the steps to the main house, a sprawling, dark adobe mansion. She disappeared inside, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a sound of utter finality. Caleb stood alone in the courtyard, his horse breathing hard beside him. The vaqueros stared at him, their expressions unreadable but hostile. He was a prisoner who had just been transferred to a larger, more complicated cell. He was her legal husband, but he was nothing. His new life began in the East Wing. Thomas, the vaquero foreman, whose face was a map of sun-scorched loyalty to Eleanor, showed him to the room. It was starker than the jail cell, but clean. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and one high window. Thomas said nothing, just pointed, and left. Caleb splashed water on his face, the alkali stinging the split in his knuckles. He was a husband. He was a prisoner. The name was different, but the bars felt the same. He spent the first days exploring the ranch, and what he found was not a home, but a military encampment. The Vale Ranch was less a cattle operation and more a fortified kingdom. The high adobe walls were patrolled day and night by armed vaqueros. They were not just cowboys. They were soldiers. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their rifles always clean, their eyes always scanning the canyons. The operation within the walls was run with the same cold precision. Eleanor Vale was its general. Caleb watched from a distance as she emerged from the main house just after dawn, dressed not in widow's black but in practical split skirts and a man's hat. Her voice was never raised, but it cut through the morning air, and men twice her size snapped to attention. She commanded absolute fear and unwavering respect. The workforce was a curious mix, seasoned Mexican vaqueros who had ridden for her late husband, and a dozen or so women. These were not housemaids. They were widows, cast-offs from town, women with nowhere else to go. Eleanor had given them sanctuary, and in return, they gave her their complete allegiance. They ran the kitchens, tended the vast gardens, mended the tack, and even, Caleb noted, practiced with firearms at a range set up behind the bunkhouse. This was Eleanor's army, built from the dispossessed, loyal only to her. He, however, was not part of it. He was an outsider, the husband in name, regarded with open suspicion by the women and a cold indifference by the men. He was Eleanor's stray, and they waited to see if he was rabid. Dinner was a trial. The first night, he was summoned to the main house by a sharp bell. The dining room was enormous, built of dark, heavy wood, dominated by a fireplace so large a man could stand in it. A long table, polished to a mirror shine, could have seated 30. Eleanor sat at one end. A single place was set for him at the other, 20 feet of empty, polished wood separating them. A quiet woman named Marta served them beef and beans in silence and then disappeared. The only sounds were the scrape of silverware on porcelain. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "Thomas will assign you to the stables. You will answer to him. You are not to give orders. You are to follow them. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, the title tasting like bile. "You will be paid a wage," she continued, as if reading from a ledger. $10 a month, plus board. The wage will be held by me against any debts you may incur." "Debts," he repeated. "For your horse's feed, for the clothes I had Marta purchase for you, for the $500 I paid to Silas Croft's pride. You are an expensive acquisition. Mr. Hart, I expect you to be a useful one." She treated him not as a husband, not even as a man, but as a piece of equipment she had been forced to procure. He finished his meal in silence, the food heavy and tasteless in his gut. That night, he went to his narrow room in the east wing. He lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The silence of the adobe walls was suffocating. It was worse than the jail. It was a tomb. He felt the familiar cold sweat prickle his skin, the tightening in his chest. The walls were closing in. He could not breathe. He rose, grabbed his blanket, and left the room. He walked past the sleeping bunkhouse, past the guards on the wall, and entered the cavernous barn. The air here was alive. It smelled of hay, horsehide, and clean manure. It was an honest smell. He found an empty stall in the far back, away from the door, and spread his blanket. He leaned his back against the rough wood partition, his rifle beside him. Here, with the horses shifting and breathing in the dark, with an open line of retreat, the panic receded. He closed his eyes, but sleep offered no escape. It only offered memory. The air was yellow with dust and smoke. Tennessee. The heat was a fist, and the air screamed. He was 21, but he felt 100. The command was to hold the small bridge outside the town, a town whose name he no longer remembered. It was a pointless defense, a gesture of defiance by a dying cause. His brother, Jesse, was beside him. Jesse was only 16, his face smudged with powder, his eyes wide with a terrible, misplaced faith in his older brother. He was clutching a rifle that was almost as tall as he was. "We'll hold him, won't we, Cal?" Jesse had asked, his voice cracking. "We'll hold him." Caleb had lied. Then the blue wave came. They swarmed from the trees, a relentless tide of Union infantry. The order was given to fire. The world dissolved into noise and smoke. Caleb loaded and fired, his shoulder raw, his mind numb. He saw men fall, saw the line buckle. "Fall back," the captain screamed. "Fall back to the church." Caleb grabbed his brother's arm. "Jesse, we're moving." Jesse turned to him, his mouth open, a look of simple surprise on his face. A dark, flowering stain was spreading across his thin chest. He didn't make a sound. He just fell, his rifle clattering on the stones of the bridge. Caleb stared. He forgot to run. He forgot the battle. He just saw the boy, his brother, lying in the dust. A Union soldier, a man with a heavy beard, raised his bayonet to charge. Caleb shot him in the throat. He grabbed Jesse's body, dragging him behind a stone wall, but it was too late. He was already gone. Caleb woke with a silent gasp, his hand clutching the wool blanket, his heart pounding a frantic, soundless rhythm against his ribs. He was in the barn. The air was cold. A horse snorted nearby. He was safe, but he was not. He would never be safe. He carried the guilt of that failure, the image of his brothers falling, like a stone in his gut. He had failed to defend the town. He had failed to protect his brother. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who had failed at the only things that ever mattered. He slept in the barn every night after that. No one questioned him. Eleanor, he suspected, did not care where he slept, as long as he was present for his duties. A week into his new life, the preacher came. Caleb was grooming Eleanor's black mare when the carriage, a simple black buggy, rolled into the compound. The man who stepped out was tall and gaunt, dressed in a preacher's black suit that was shiny with age. His eyes burned with the self-righteous fire of a man who sees sin in every shadow. Caleb recognized him from town. Reverend Blackwood. The preacher marched to the porch of the main house and struck the door with his cane. "Eleanor Vale, show yourself!" Eleanor appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. She had been in the smokehouse. "Reverend, you are trespassing. I am here on the Lord's business." Blackwood boomed, his voice carrying across the yard. The vaqueros and the women stopped their work, watching. "I am here to speak on the damnation of your soul." Eleanor crossed her arms. "My soul is my own affair. Reverend, state your business and leave my land." "Your business is the town's shame," he accused, pointing a trembling finger at her. "We tolerated your arrogance after the judge's passing. We tolerated your unwomanly behavior. But this, to pluck a vagrant from the jail, a killer, a southerner, and to marry him in defiance of God and man, you have brought a serpent into your home. Woman." Caleb stopped brushing the horse. His hand tightened on the curry comb. "He is a godless man," the preacher continued, his voice rising in fervor. "And you are a godless woman. You are Jezebel, consorting with evil. The town council condemns you. The church condemns you. God himself condemns this unholy union. He will strike you down for your pride." Eleanor walked slowly down the steps until she was standing just a few feet from him. She was shorter than him, but she seemed to tower over him. "God," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "has had 16 years to strike down the men who burned my family's farm in Georgia and left my mother to die. He has been busy. I do not expect him to trouble himself with my marriage." The preacher recoiled, as if she had struck him. "Blasphemy!" "Truth," Eleanor countered. "My husband, Mr. Hart, is a legal matter. My land is a legal matter. Neither involves you. If you ever set foot on my property again, Reverend, I will have my men remove you, and they will not be gentle." Blackwood stared at her, his face purple with rage. He saw the cold resolve in her eyes and, beyond her, the watchful vaqueros, their hands resting near their pistols. He was a man of God, but he was not a fool. "You will burn. Eleanor Vale," he whispered, a final curse. "You will burn for this." He turned, climbed back into his buggy, and whipped his horse out of the gates. Eleanor watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned, her eyes sweeping the yard, daring anyone to meet her gaze. The workers immediately bent back to their tasks. Her eyes found Caleb, standing by the stable. He just looked at her. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and went back into the house. The tension on the ranch thickened. Caleb's presence was no longer just a curiosity. It was a scandal. The wall between the ranch and the town was now solid and absolute. Weeks passed. Caleb worked. He broke horses, mended fences, and shoveled manure. He spoke little, and the hands, respecting his silence and his skill with the animals, began to give him a wide berth of wary respect. He was a hard worker, and he was quiet. That was enough. The tension with Eleanor remained. A taut wire pulled between the barn where he slept and the main house where she ruled. They ate their silent, cold dinners. The 20 feet of wood between them, an impassable canyon. He was her husband. He was her hired hand. One night, the wire snapped. It was late, past midnight, with a sliver of moon that offered almost no light. The air was still, heavy with the coming cold of deep autumn. Caleb was in his stall, half awake, the memory of Jesse's face keeping him from sleep. He heard it, a faint twang. It was not a ranch sound. It was the sound of a wire being cut. He was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand. He moved without a sound, a shadow gliding through the deeper shadows of the barn. He slipped out the side door, his eyes straining against the blackness. He heard a low whisper, coming from the north pasture, near the massive, dry hay stores they had spent the last month cutting and stacking for the winter. He saw a flicker, a match being struck. There were 3 of them, dark shapes, low to the ground. One man held a torch, shielding the new flame with his body. They were raiders, hired men. He knew their kind. They were here to burn the feed, to cripple the ranch before winter set in. This was the work of the Vale cousins. He didn't shout an alarm. An alarm would bring the vaqueros, but it would also scatter the raiders and start the fight. He was a soldier. He knew how to end a fight before it began. He flanked them, moving in a low crouch along the outside of the corral, using the fence posts as cover. The wind was in his face, carrying the smell of their kerosene. He was within 30 yards. He raised his rifle, took aim at the man with the torch, and whistled. A single, low, sharp note. On the high wall, he heard a sentry call out in Spanish. "Quien vive?" The raiders startled. The man with the torch stood up, lifting it high to throw it. Caleb fired. The rifle's report shattered the night. The man with the torch dropped as if his strings had been cut, the torch falling harmlessly into the dust. "Ambush!" one of the others yelled, firing blindly into the darkness toward the wall. The ranch exploded into chaos. Bells clanged. Men shouted from the bunkhouse. Lights flared in the main house. A second raider, a large man, saw Caleb's muzzle flash and charged him, firing a pistol. The shot went wide. Caleb dropped his rifle and moved inside the man's reach. The raider swung the empty pistol like a club. Caleb blocked it with his forearm, the impact rattling his teeth. He drove his fist into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over with a grunt. As the man gasped for air, Caleb brought his elbow down on the back of his neck. The raider collapsed, unconscious. The third man was already running, disappearing into the dark of the open range. By the time Tomas and the vaqueros arrived with lanterns, it was over. Caleb was standing over the unconscious man, his rifle back in his hands. The first man was dead, shot clean through the heart. The hands surrounded Caleb, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. He had moved with a speed and lethal precision they had never seen. He had saved the winter feed, the lifeblood of the ranch. Tomas looked at the dead man, then at Caleb. He didn't speak, but he reached out and clapped Caleb once on the shoulder, a gesture of profound, earned respect. The porch light of the main house flared. Eleanor stood there, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Her black hair was unbound, falling over the shoulders of a white nightgown. She looked wild and magnificent, a queen surveying a battlefield. Her eyes took in the scene, the dead raider, the captive being tied up, and Caleb, standing apart, the smoke from his rifle still faintly visible in the lantern light. Their eyes met across the yard. An hour later, after the captive was dragged to the root cellar to be questioned and the body of the dead man was covered with a tarp, a young woman came to the barn. "La patrona," she said, her voice trembling. "She wants to see you, in the study." Caleb picked up his rifle and followed. The study was dark, lit by a single lamp on her desk. The room was filled with the smell of leather and her faint, clean scent of lye soap. She was standing by the unlit fireplace, still in her nightgown and a heavy wool robe. "You proved useful tonight, Mr. Hart," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "The ranch thanks you." Caleb said nothing. He leaned his rifle against the wall and waited. "But do not mistake this," she continued, her voice hardening as she regained her composure. "As a change in our arrangement, you are still my employee. You follow my orders. You protect my property. You did your job." She turned to face him fully. "Do not ever act on your own again without my direct authority." The coldness of it, the way she dismissed the violence, the death, as a simple chore, broke something that had been brittle in him for weeks. "Property," he said. His voice was dangerously quiet, a rumble of thunder. "Is that what I am to you? Another head of cattle, a guard dog you bought to keep the wolves away?" He took a step toward her. "I am not your property, Eleanor. And those men weren't trying to steal a horse. They were trying to burn you out. That wasn't a job. That was an attack. This is a war, something you sit in this big house and know nothing about." Her eyes flashed, chips of dark ice. "I know more about war than you can imagine. Drifter, I know about survival. Something you seem to have failed at miserably until I pulled you from that jail." It was the wrong thing to say. The word failed struck the raw nerve of his guilt. "You didn't pull me out," he snarled, closing the distance between them until he was towering over her. "You just put me in a bigger cage. You use everyone. You use that coward Brody to plant evidence. You use those poor women and Thomas as your private army. And you use me, my name, to keep your precious land." "How dare you?" she whispered, her face pale with a fury that matched his own. She did not back away. "You are nothing. A broken soldier from a lost cause. I gave you a life. You gave me a leash," he said, his voice raw. He was too close, his anger a palpable heat. He could see the pulse beating in her throat. "I'd have rather had the rope." The words hung in the air, brutal and honest. She reacted without thought, driven by a lifetime of being controlled, of being threatened, of being underestimated. Her hand flew up and she slapped him across the face. The sound was sharp, final, like a gunshot in the silent room. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared down at her, the red imprint of her hand already rising on his scarred cheek. The air between them changed. The anger was still there, but it was suffocated by something else, something thick and electric. It was the sudden, shocking realization of their intimacy. They were two people trapped in a cage of their own making, and they had just drawn blood. Her chest was heaving. His eyes burned into hers. He saw the fury in her expression, but beneath it, for the first time, he saw fear, and beneath the fear, he saw a loneliness so profound it mirrored his own. He didn't let her go. He hadn't even realized he'd grabbed her arm until he felt her tense. His other hand came up, not to strike back, but to tangle in the unbound hair at the back of her head. He cupped her skull, his fingers tightening. "Don't," she breathed, her word a plea, or a warning. He ignored it. He pulled her to him and his mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was an explosion. It was all the violence of the raid, all the bitterness of his past, and all the icy desperation of her present. It was a collision of two people who had nothing left to lose. It was brutal and angry and starving. He kissed her like a man drowning, taking the breath from her lungs. For a second, she was rigid with shock. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half groan, her free hand fisted in the front of his shirt, holding on as if the world was tilting off its axis. She kissed him back, her mouth opening against his, meeting his violence with her own desperate, repressed hunger. It was a confession, an admission of the one thing they shared, an aching, unbearable need to feel something, anything, other than cold. He broke it off as suddenly as he had begun, shoving her back. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the desk. They stared at each other, breathing hard, their faces inches apart. The shock of what they had done was a physical blow, leaving them both reeling. The mask of the Iron Widow was shattered. Eleanor's eyes were wide, her lips bruised and swollen. She looked terrified, not of him, but of herself. She turned and fled. He heard her boots pounding down the hall, the slam of her bedroom door. He heard the metallic grate of a key turning in the lock. Caleb stood alone in the study for a long time, the silence of the house ringing in his ears. He could still taste her. He could still feel the impossible, fragile softness of her lips. He raised his fingers to his cheek where she had struck him. He clenched his fists, his nails biting so deep into his palms that he felt the sharp pain. He turned, retrieved his rifle, and walked out of the house. He didn't go to his room in the east wing. He went back to the barn, to the darkest stall. He sank onto the hay, pressing his forehead against the rough, cold wood, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. For 3 days, the ranch operated under the weight of that kiss. It was a ghost that haunted every shared space. Caleb and Eleanor avoided each other with a grim, practiced determination. He took his meals in the bunkhouse with the vaqueros, a move that surprised them, but one they accepted with a quiet nod. He worked himself to the point of exhaustion, breaking the wildest mustangs in the corral, his fury and confusion finding an outlet in the sweat and dust. Eleanor buried herself in the ranch ledgers, her entries sharper and more precise than ever. Marta, the housekeeper, would bring her a tray for dinner, and it would sit untouched outside her study door for hours. The main house was a tomb. The barn was a refuge. The 20 feet of polished wood in the dining room had become an impassable, 1,000-mile wasteland. On the 4th morning, the tension broke. Caleb was in the stable, reshoeing his own horse, the rasp of the file against the hoof the only sound. "Mr. Hart." He froze. He had not heard her approach. He set the hoof down and straightened, turning slowly. Eleanor stood in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. She was dressed for riding, in her practical split skirt and boots. Her face was pale, her expression carefully neutral. "I am riding out to the west pasture," she said, her voice formal. "The fence line was reported weak by the South Canyon. I require a second rider and a second rifle." It was not an invitation. It was an order, carefully worded as a request. He knew she rode alone all the time. This was not about the fence. It was about the kiss. It was about the space between them that had become too loud to bear. "Thomas is a better shot," Caleb said. "Thomas is overseeing the branding." "You are my husband," she stated, the word hanging in the air, sharp as glass. "It is appropriate you accompany me. Get your horse. We leave in 5 minutes." She turned and walked away before he could refuse. He saddled his horse, his gut tight. He checked his Winchester, sliding it into the scabbard, and mounted. She was waiting by the main gate, her black mare already restless. They rode out, side by side, the silence between them as vast and empty as the plain stretching before them. They rode for 2 hours, the only sound the steady beat of hooves on the dry earth and the cry of a distant hawk. Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon. She kept hers pointed straight ahead. Finally, they crested a high ridge, and the land fell away into a deep, rocky arroyo. Eleanor pulled her mare to a halt. "This is the west pasture," she said. "Fence looks sound from here." Caleb replied, his gaze scanning the barbed wire line that ran along the canyon's edge. "It is," she said. She did not look at him. She stared down into the shadowed rocks below. "He died down there." Caleb turned in his saddle. "Who?" "Judge Vale, my husband." The word husband was a curse on her tongue. "The man the town thinks I poisoned." She dismounted, her movements stiff. She walked to the edge of the cliff, leaving her horse. Caleb swung down and followed, keeping a respectful distance. "He was not a good man," she said, her voice flat, carried away by the wind. "He was not a cruel man in the way most people understand it. He never raised a hand to me." She picked up a small stone, turning it over in her gloved fingers. "His cruelty was in control. He bought me from my father. My father had debts. The judge had money. I was a transaction, and he never let me forget it." She looked at Caleb, her eyes for the first time holding no defense, only a cold, tired truth. He did not want love. He did not want a wife. He wanted a beautiful object to display, and one that he could lock away. He enjoyed my silence. He enjoyed my coldness. He told me it proved I was well broken. Caleb's hands clenched. He thought of the war, of men who owned other men. He had not realized he was living in the house of such a man. The town, she continued. They see this ranch, this power. They think I stole it. The truth is, I earned it. While he was in his study with his brandy, I was in the saddle. While he was in town with his women, I was negotiating cattle prices. I built this place with my own hands, and he hated me for it. He hated that the possession he had bought was more capable than he was. She threw the stone into the canyon. It disappeared, making no sound. "So you did not poison him," Caleb stated. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I did not have to. His arrogance did it for me." She pointed down. He had been drinking for 2 days. He was furious that a contract I had written was praised by a cattle baron from Cheyenne. He said he would show me how a real rider handled the canyons. He took his best horse and rode it straight for this ridge. Full gallop. It was dusk. He was drunk. Her voice was devoid of emotion. A simple recitation of facts. The horse knew better. It tried to refuse the jump over the wash. He spurred it. The horse stumbled. It fell. He fell. I found him 3 hours later, broken on those rocks. His neck was snapped. The horse was already dead beside him. "You rode for help?" Caleb said, guessing the rest. I rode for the doctor. By the time I returned, the whispers had started. It was too convenient. The cold wife, the dead husband, the vast inheritance. Silas Croft, his distant cousin, was the first to say poison. The town, they preferred that story. It made more sense to them than a woman like me simply being free. She looked at him, her defenses back in place. "No one believed me. I do not expect you to, either, but that is the truth." Caleb stared into the canyon. He saw the scene clearly. The drunken man, the terrified horse, the dark, unyielding woman finding her freedom in the rocks. "I believe you," he said. She turned to him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Why?" "Because," Caleb said, his voice rough, "I know what it is to have a past that everyone else writes for you. A past they won't let you escape." He leaned against a wind-worn boulder, the weight of his own confession pressing on him. "I told you I was a soldier. I did not tell you what that meant. It means I lost everything. My farm, my home, my brother." He paused. The name Jesse, a silent wound in his throat. After the surrender, there was nothing left. Just ash. I went back to what was left of my town. There was a woman, Elspeth. We were to be married. Before the war. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. I came back with nothing, not a dollar, no land, just this. He tapped his temple, near the scar. And the nights. She had waited 4 years. Her father was sick. They were starving. She married a merchant from Ohio. A man with a supply business, a man with security. "Did you hate her for it?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet. "No." Caleb said, "I never blamed her. How could I? I was a ghost. I was half a man, filled with things I could not wash off. She deserved a life. She deserved to be safe. I was not safe." He pushed off the boulder and walked to the canyon's edge, standing near her. "That's when I came west. I wasn't looking to build anything. I wasn't looking for a new start." He met her gaze, his own truth as stark and brutal as hers. "I was looking for peace, or I was looking for death. Whichever one found me first." It did not matter. A profound silence settled between them. They were two broken, jagged things, standing on the edge of a cliff, having shown each other the pieces they kept hidden. The wind changed. It shifted from the north, carrying a sudden, sharp chill and the metallic smell of ozone. The sky, blue and clear a moment before, was now a bruised, churning purple on the western horizon. "A storm," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with alarm. "A bad one. It's moving too fast. We will not make it back. We need cover," Caleb said, scanning the rocky landscape. Now. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, followed by a low, vibrating rumble of thunder. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. "There," he pointed. "That overhang, in the rocks." It was a shallow cave, barely a dark mouth in the side of the arroyo, about 100 yards away. "Go!" he yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the horses. They mounted and spurred their animals, galloping across the rough terrain as the sky opened. The rain came not in drops, but in a solid, driving sheet. The wind howled, trying to rip the hats from their heads. They reached the cave just as the deluge hit, a deafening roar of water and hail. They scrambled off the horses, pulling them deep into the shelter. It was not a large cave, just a deep overhang that protected them from the worst of the wind and rain. They were soaked to the bone, shivering. "We need a fire," Caleb said, his teeth chattering. He moved deeper into the cave, feeling along the dry, dusty floor. "There's brush, dry scrub." He pulled out his pocket knife and his flint. It took him several minutes, his hands numb and clumsy, but he managed to get a spark to catch on a handful of dry tinder. He carefully fed it twigs. Then, larger branches of dead scrub brush he broke from the back of the cave. A small, sputtering fire flared to life, casting a weak, dancing light on their faces. They huddled near it, the heat pathetic against the cold, wet reality of their clothes. The storm raged outside, a primal fury of thunder that shook the ground and lightning that lit the cave in stark, white flashes. Eleanor was shivering, her face pale, her lips blue. Caleb moved closer. "You need to get out of those wet things. You'll freeze." She looked at him, her eyes wide, trapped by the cold and the intimacy of the small, dark space. "We both do," he said. He turned his back, unbuttoning his wet shirt. He stripped it off, his scarred back exposed to the firelight. He wrung it out as best he could and laid it on a rock near the flames. He kept his trousers on, but sat in his wool undershirt. He heard her fumbling with her own clothes. When he turned back, she had taken off her heavy skirt and jacket. She sat in her chemise and drawers, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to hide herself. Her unbound hair, dark and wet, clung to her face and shoulders. He took his dry blanket roll from his saddle. "Here." He draped it around her shoulders. She looked up, her shivering so violent it shook her whole body. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence, watching the fire, listening to the storm. The confessions from the ridge were still in the air, raw and exposed. He was not a drifter. She was not a poisoner. They were just Caleb and Eleanor. "I am cold," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her, saw the vulnerability she had never shown anyone. He sat beside her, not as her master, not as her employee, but as the only other person in the world. He lifted his arm, an unspoken offer. She hesitated for only a second. Then, with a small, shuddering sigh, she moved into his embrace, pressing her cold body against his side. He wrapped his arm, and the blanket, around her, pulling her tight. He could feel the desperate, rabbit-quick beat of her heart against his ribs. She rested her head on his shoulder. He could feel her shivering begin to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor. He was intensely aware of her, the smell of her rain-soaked hair, the feel of her skin through the thin cotton. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice so quiet he barely heard it over the rain. He looked down. She was looking up at him, her eyes dark and searching in the firelight. The ice was gone. All her defenses were gone, washed away by the rain and the truth. He did not know who moved first. It did not matter. His mouth found hers, and this time, there was no anger. There was no violence. It was tentative, a question. Her lips were cold, but they softened under his. She responded with a desperate, hesitant need. It was the kiss of two people who had been starving for a single, simple touch. It was clumsy and aching and deeply emotional. His hand moved from her shoulder to her face, his fingers threading into her wet hair. Her hand came up to rest on his chest, over his heart. It was a gesture of surrender and of trust. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, desperate exploration. It was all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, all the loneliness. He lowered her back onto the dry earth of the cave floor, his body shielding her from the cold. In the flickering light of the small fire, with the world roaring and breaking apart outside, they made love. It was not the angry clash of their first kiss, nor the controlled bargain of their wedding. It was a raw, tentative, and deeply human thing, a desperate, emotional claiming of life in the midst of the storm. When the storm finally passed, the world outside was washed clean and silent. The first light of dawn, gray and pearly, crept into the mouth of the cave. Eleanor woke first. She was warm. She was wrapped in Caleb's arms, her head on his chest, the wool blanket covering them both. The fire was just embers. She lay still, listening to the steady, slow beat of his heart under her ear. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. She carefully raised her head. He was asleep. The hard, watchful lines of his face were gone, softened by sleep. He looked younger, almost peaceful. The scar on his cheek was just a line, not a warning. A feeling spread through her chest, a slow, aching warmth that was so foreign she almost recoiled from it. It was not control, or fear, or anger. It was something else. A small, involuntary smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile in years. It felt strange, like a muscle she had not used. His eyes flickered open. The smile vanished. She sat up instantly, pulling the blanket around her, her mask of cold composure snapping back into place. "The storm is over," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet cave. "We should ride." Caleb watched her, his expression unreadable. He sat up, the spell broken. "Yes, ma'am." They dressed in their damp clothes and rode back to the ranch in a new, profound, and complicated silence. When they arrived, the compound was bustling. Thomas was in the yard, his face etched with worry. When he saw them ride in together, soaked, caked in mud, but safe, his relief was visible. But he also saw more. He saw the way Caleb dismounted first and immediately moved to Eleanor's horse. He saw the way Caleb offered his hand, and the way Eleanor took it. He saw the way she did not pull away, but allowed him to steady her for a moment. The vaqueros saw it. Marta, who had been waiting on the porch, saw it. The look that passed between the master and his strange new husband was no longer one of bargains and hostility. The marriage, they whispered, was real now. The rumors spread from the ranch to the town like wildfire. The story of the patrona and her drifter husband, trapped overnight in a storm, was far juicier than poison. A week later, Eleanor was summoned to Cedar Bluff. A letter, bearing the town seal, requested her presence at a council meeting. It was an ambush. The meeting hall, which also served as the church, was full. Reverend Blackwood was there, as was Silas Croft and the other men who ran the town. "Mrs. Vale," the mayor began, "a man who owned the bank. It has come to our attention that you have been engaging in behavior unbefitting a woman of your station." "My behavior," Eleanor said, her voice ice, "is my own. Not when it reflects on this town," Reverend Blackwood interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "You have taken that vagrant into your home. We tolerated that as a legal defense. But now you flaunt your immoral behavior. You spend nights, unchaperoned, with this man. You are violating the sacred social codes of this community. You are a harlot." "You call my husband a vagrant, and me a harlot," Eleanor said, her voice deadly. "Be very careful, Reverend. It is shameful," Silas Croft spat. "We will not have our town's name sullied. The judge's good name is being dragged through the mud by his own widow. They accused her. They condemned her. They threatened her." Eleanor stood through it all, her back straight, her face a mask of stone. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. When they were finished, she simply said, "If you are quite done," and walked out. She was shaking, not with fear, but with a deep, cold rage. She walked to the general store to buy the grain she had come for, determined to show them they had not broken her. Caleb was waiting outside, leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood. He had told her he needed to see the blacksmith about a wagon wheel. She knew he had followed her. As she walked toward the store's entrance, one of Croft's ranch hands, a burly man who had been at the meeting, stepped in front of her. "Make way for the Queen," he sneered, his voice loud for the street to hear. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering. Then he spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the boardwalk, just inches from the hem of her skirt. "Shameful," the man growled. "Lying with Reb trash." Eleanor froze before she could even breathe. Caleb moved. He did not go for his gun. He was on the man in 2 strides. He grabbed the front of the man's shirt, twisting it in his fist, and slammed him backward against the store's wooden hitching rail. The crack of the man's head against the solid wood echoed down the silent street. Caleb's face was inches from the man's, his eyes flat and deadly. "You will apologize to my wife," he said, his voice a low, chilling rasp. The man, terrified, his bravado vanishing in the face of this cold, sudden violence, stammered, I'm sorry. I apologize to her." Caleb's grip tightened, cutting off the man's air. "Mrs. Vale, ma'am, I'm sorry." The man choked out, his eyes wide with panic. Caleb stared at him for 1 more second, then shoved him. The man crumpled to the ground, scrambling away backward in the dust like a crab. The entire street was dead silent. Everyone had seen it. The quiet, watchful drifter had not defended his employer. He had defended his wife. Caleb turned to Eleanor. He did not say a word. He just offered her his arm. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the man who had shared her blanket in the storm. She saw the man who had believed her. She took his arm. They rode back to the ranch, the silence between them no longer empty, but full. It was full of the storm, the cave, the fight, and the unspoken words. That night, Caleb did not go to the barn. He found Eleanor on the front porch, staring up at the spray of stars that glittered in the black, high desert sky. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, aimed at the night. "For what you did, in town, he insulted my wife." Caleb replied simply. A long moment passed. She finally turned her head to look at him, her face silvered by the starlight. "I never meant to want this," she confessed, her voice so small he almost missed it. "I never meant to want you. This was a bargain. It was just land." He turned to face her, his heart, which he had thought dead for 16 years, giving a slow, heavy beat. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I never meant to want you either." He reached out and took her hand. It was cold. He enclosed it in both of his, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles, warming her. "Eleanor," he said. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the violence of the study, nor the desperate need of the cave. It was slow. It was tender. It was a promise, made under the open, watchful sky. She kissed him back, her hand leaving his to rest on his heart. Their union was no longer just legal. It was real, and it was the most fragile, dangerous thing either of them had ever owned. The fragile new peace at the Vale Ranch lasted less than a week. It was shattered not by a bullet, but by the squeak of buggy wheels. A man arrived from Cedar Bluff, not a rancher or a preacher, but something far more dangerous, a government man. His name was Mr. Fenton, a land agent from the territorial capital, and he carried a worn leather briefcase filled with legal trouble. He sat in Eleanor's study, the same room where she had slapped Caleb, the same room where they had first kissed. Fenton, a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles, refused a drink and dabbed at his sweaty upper lip with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Vale," he began, his voice thin. "This is not a social call. I'm here on behalf of the United States Territorial Land Office. A new petition has been filed by your late husband's cousins, the Vale family of St. Louis." That is old news. Mr. Fenton, Eleanor said, her voice cold. She stood by the fireplace. Caleb stood near the door, his presence a silent, solid warning. He was her husband now, in fact as well as in name, and the entire territory knew it. Not quite, ma'am, Fenton said, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a sheaf of papers. The first petition was flimsy. It concerned your ability, as a woman, to manage the estate, your marriage to Mr. Hart. He glanced at Caleb, has effectively nullified that claim. He slid a new document onto the desk. This one is more substantial. The Vale cousins allege that a significant portion of your property, specifically the entire North Range, comprising some 20,000 acres, was acquired by Judge Vale through fraudulent paperwork. Eleanor went rigid. Caleb watched her, saw the blood drain from her face. They claim, Fenton continued, reading from his notes, that the judge's original title, filed in 1874, was based on a land grant that never existed. They have provided correspondence suggesting the judge forged the signatures of railroad officials. If this is true, that land was never legally his. It remains public domain, or belongs to a prior claimant. In which case, his cousins are petitioning to have it opened for refiling, at which point they intend to claim it themselves. It is a lie, Eleanor said, but her voice lacked its usual iron. Perhaps, Fenton said, standing. He would not meet her eyes. But the territorial court finds the evidence compelling. They have sided with the petitioners. A federal marshal will be here in 1 month to serve the papers and reassess the boundary. Unless you can provide definitive proof of title, you will lose the North Range and Mrs. Vale. Given that the North Range contains your primary water rights, losing it will mean losing this ranch. Good day. He packed his briefcase and left. The silence in the study as heavy as a shroud. Eleanor stared at the wall, her hands clenched at her sides. He did it, she whispered. The bastard. He did it. He was always so proud of his cleverness. He bragged that he had built an empire from paper. Then we fight him, Caleb said, his voice low and steady. We fight the paper. With what? She turned on him, her eyes flashing with a desperate, brittle anger. The law? The law is Mr. Fenton. The law is the cousins in St. Louis. The law is a piece of paper that says a woman cannot be trusted and a dead man's lies are gospel. We file counterclaims, Caleb said, moving to the desk. He was a soldier. This was a new battlefield. We gather testimony. We find people who knew what the judge did. Eleanor let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Testimony? From who? Caleb? From the people in town? From Reverend Blackwood? Who calls me a harlot? From Silas Croft? Who wishes me ruined? The man you threw in the dust spat at my feet. There is not a soul in Cedar Bluff who would raise a hand to help me. They would rather see me burn. Caleb was silent. He knew she was right. The town had judged her long ago. He paced the room, his mind racing, moving from legal strategy to something more fundamental. This fraud, he said, stopping. If the judge forged the railroad papers, who held the land before? Who did he really cheat? Eleanor looked away, walking to the window. She stared out at the high canyon walls of the North Range, her land, her fortress. The Apache, she said, her voice barely audible. The Mescalero? It was their wintering ground for 1,000 years before we came. The judge, he called it his Indian bargain. He boasted of it. When he was drunk, said he'd traded them 10 crates of whiskey and a box of worthless mining bonds for the water rights. Caleb's gaze sharpened. The Apache. They are not an option, she said, turning back, her face hard. They are hostile. They're ghosts. They kill ranchers who get too close to the high country. To ride into their territory is suicide. They are not ghosts. Caleb said. They are men. And they hate the judge's memory more than they hate us. They are the prior claimant. They are the only witness that matters. And what do you propose? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. That we ride to their camp and ask them to testify in a white man's court. They would kill us on sight. They would torture us. They will not kill us, Caleb said. They will speak to me. She stared at him, seeing the absolute certainty in his eyes. It was a confidence that went beyond simple bravery. It was knowledge. How can you know that? I've been in this territory a long time. Eleanor, longer than I've been in Cedar Bluff. I know the high country. I know them. They will listen. She searched his face, her fear warring with the fragile, growing trust she had placed in him. This was not like facing down a gunman in the street. This was asking her to risk her life on his word, on a secret he had kept. It is a desperate move, she whispered. We are desperate, he replied. They are the only ones who can prove the fraud. They are the only ones who can give us the truth. We need their story. Eleanor looked at the document Fenton had left, the legal paper that would ruin her. Then she looked back at Caleb. He was right. The law would not save her. Only the truth would. We ride tomorrow, she said. They left before dawn, just the two of them. They told no one, not even Tomas. They carried rifles, bedrolls, and enough food for 4 days. They rode north, past the boundaries of the Vale Ranch, past the last pretense of safety, and into the high, rugged country of the Mescalero Apache. They rode for 2 days, climbing into a landscape of red rock and stark, wind-carved canyons. The air was thin and cold. It was a beautiful, lethal place. Caleb moved with a quiet, watchful confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, his rifle always loose in his scabbard. Eleanor rode beside him, her fear a tight knot in her stomach, but her trust in him absolute. On the 3rd morning, they found the camp. It was not a camp, really, but a rancheria, nestled in a hidden, bowl-shaped canyon, sheltered from the wind. Smoke from a dozen small fires rose in the cold morning air. They did not see the Apache until they were upon them. They appeared from the rocks, 4 warriors on horseback, materializing as if from the earth itself. They were silent, their faces hard, their rifles leveled. Caleb immediately raised his left hand, palm out, a sign of peace. He did not reach for his gun. We come to speak with your chief, Caleb said, his voice calm and clear. The warriors said nothing. One of them, a young man with hard, assessing eyes, motioned with his rifle. Dismount. They were led on foot into the center of the village, a collection of wickiups and skin lodges. Women stopped their work to watch them, their expressions flat and hostile. Children hid. Caleb and Eleanor were halted in front of a larger lodge. Their rifles were taken from them. After a long, tense wait, a man emerged. He was old, his face a web of deep lines, his long gray hair bound by a simple leather band. He wore a mixture of traditional skins and a tattered blue Union cavalry jacket. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, missed nothing. This was Chatto, the chief. He looked at Eleanor first, his gaze dismissive, hostile. Then he looked at Caleb. He stared for a long, heavy minute. Caleb spoke, his voice low and respectful. He did not use many words, but he spoke the truth. We are not here to harm. We are not here to take. My wife, she is the widow of the man who stole this land from you. The man called Judge Vale. Chatto's expression darkened at the name. Now, Caleb continued, the judge's own family uses his lies to steal the land from his wife. They use the white man's court. We need the truth. We need your story of the Indian bargain. We seek your help to shame the memory of the man who cheated you. Chatto was silent for a long time. The wind whistled through the canyon. I have seen you, Chatto said finally, his voice a dry rasp. He pointed a long, bony finger at Caleb. Long ago, before you came to this town, the Blue Soldiers, they attacked our camp on the Cimarron River. It was winter. A massacre. Caleb's face remained still, but his eyes held the memory. I saw you, Chatto repeated. You were not a soldier. You wore the gray coat, a drifter. The cavalry was running down women and children. A horse, a cavalry mount, was about to trample a child. My granddaughter. Chatto stepped closer. You, You ran from the rocks. You grabbed the child. You threw her to her mother, who pulled her into the trees. Then you vanished. The blue soldiers did not see you, but I saw you. You are the gray coat." Caleb nodded once. "I remember." It had been a moment of pure instinct, a reaction against the slaughter, a single, pointless act of decency in a world of madness. "You saved the blood of my blood." Chatto said, "We do not forget. The judge was a snake. His cousins are snakes. His wife," he looked at Eleanor, "is the snake's mate. But you are the gray coat. You ask for the truth. I will give it to you." He turned and spoke to a younger man, who disappeared into the lodge. He returned with a worn leather satchel. Chatto took from it a piece of paper, folded many times, yellowed and stained. "The judge's paper," he said, handing it to Caleb. "His bargain." Caleb unfolded it. It was a letter, written in the judge's own elegant hand, addressed to a business partner in Santa Fe. In it, he boasted of the entire transaction. He detailed how he had traded 10 crates of cheap whiskey and worthless paper for the rights to the North Range. He had gotten the Apache leaders drunk and had them sign a document in English they could not read. It was a full confession. "This," Caleb said, his voice tight. "This is the truth. Thank you." "It is not a gift," Chatto said. "It is a debt. Now go. The snake's family is powerful. They have men watching the canyons. You are not safe." They were given back their rifles and horses. The Apache warriors escorted them to the edge of the canyon and then vanished, melting back into the rocks. They rode hard, not stopping. The letter was a fire in Caleb's shirt, a piece of paper that could save their lives. They had to get it to the ranch, then to the capital. They pushed the horses, taking a shortcut through a narrow, winding pass that would cut a day off their journey. They were halfway through the pass, the walls rising 500 feet on either side. When the shot rang out, the bullet's echo slammed against the canyon walls, sounding like a dozen rifles. Caleb heard the wet, sickening thump of the lead hitting flesh. He saw Eleanor's body jolt, a spray of dust fly from her shoulder. Her face went slack with shock, her mouth opening in a silent cry. "Caleb!" she gasped, and slumped forward in the saddle. He reacted with the speed of a soldier. He spurred his horse alongside hers, grabbing her reins. "Get down!" he roared. He half shoved, half lowered her from the saddle. She fell in a heap behind a large boulder. A second shot chipped the rock where her head had been, whining as it ricocheted down the canyon. "Stay down!" Caleb yelled. He dove from his own horse, rolling behind a jumble of scree, his Winchester in his hand. He scanned the ridge above, his eyes searching for the muzzle flash. He saw him, a single rifleman, high above, partially hidden by a pinyon pine. A hired gunman, one of the Vale cousins' men, just as Chatto had warned. The gunman, seeing Caleb move, stood up slightly to get a clearer shot. It was the last mistake he ever made. Caleb's rifle was already at his shoulder. He did not aim. He knew where the man was. He breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and racked another round in one fluid. Practiced motion. The report of his rifle was sharp and final. High on the ridge, the man stood straight up, as if surprised. He dropped his rifle, clutched his chest, and pitched forward, tumbling down the rocky cliff face, landing in a broken heap on the canyon floor 50 yards away. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the panicked breathing of the horses. Caleb ran to Eleanor. She was conscious, pale as death, her left hand clutching her right shoulder. Blood, dark and thick, streamed between her fingers, soaking the front of her shirt. "It burns," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock and pain. "Caleb, it burns." He tore open her shirt. The wound was high, in the thick muscle of her shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through. It was bad, but it had missed the bone, missed the lung. "You're all right," he said, his voice rough. "You're all right. It's clean." He ripped a long strip from his own shirt, wadding it up. "Press this, hard, as hard as you can." She cried out as he pressed the makeshift bandage to the wound. But she did it. "We have to get out of here," he said, his eyes scanning the ridges. There could be more. He got her to her feet. She nearly fainted, her weight sagging against him. He lifted her onto his own horse, a dead weight, and mounted behind her, holding her upright, one arm clamped around her waist, his hand pressing the bandage to her back. He grabbed the reins of her horse and kicked his own into a desperate, painful trot. Leaving the dead gunman where he lay, he rode for hours, pushing the horses until they frothed. Eleanor faded in and out of consciousness, muttering against his chest. The sun began to set, and the desert cold descended. He had to find shelter. He had to tend the wound. At dusk, he saw it, tucked into a fold in the hills. A small, dark shape, an old line shack, abandoned by ranchers years ago. It was barely 4 walls and a rotting roof, but it was shelter. He got her inside, laying her gently on the dirt floor. He used his bedroll to pillow her head. She was shivering, her teeth chattering. The fever was already setting in. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." He worked with frantic energy. He gathered dry brush and splintered wood from the rotted door frame. He built a small, hot fire in the dilapidated stone fireplace. He fetched water from his canteen. He lit a lantern. He had to clean the wound. He had to stop the bleeding for good. He took his hunting knife and held it in the flames of the fire until the blade glowed a dull red. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle. She opened her eyes, hazy with fever. "This is going to hurt. I have to seal it." He handed her a piece of leather from his saddlebag. "Bite this! Bite it hard!" Her eyes filled with terror, but she nodded. She put the leather between her teeth. He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He pressed the glowing metal to the entry wound. Then the exit. A terrible, muffled scream was torn from her throat. Her body arched off the floor, and then she went limp, fainting from the pain. He bound the wounds tightly with clean strips of cloth from his saddlebag. He covered her with his blanket, then lay down beside her on the cold dirt floor, pulling her close, trying to give her his own body heat. The night was endless. The fever took her. She thrashed and shivered, her skin burning hot. She spoke, her voice thin, calling for her mother, for Jesse, for him. She was in Shiloh with him, in the canyon, in the judge's house. Caleb held her, wiping her face with a damp cloth, his heart breaking. He had faced down armies, had walked away from his own death, but this helplessness was a torture he had never known. He had come west to die, a man with nothing left, and now, the one thing he had found, the one person who had pulled him back to the world of the living, was being stolen from him. He felt the cold, hard knot of his composure, the wall he had built around himself for 16 years, finally crumbled to dust. He put his head down on the pallet next to her, his voice breaking, a raw, desperate whisper in the dark cabin. "Don't you leave me! Don't you dare die! Eleanor, please!" He was sobbing, the sound silent, racking his entire body. "I love you. Do you hear me? I love you, not just as a man loves a woman, but as a man who has nothing else. You are the only thing I believe in. You are all I have. Don't you leave me! Please! Don't go!" He stayed like that, holding her hand, his head bowed, until the fire burned down to embers and the first gray light of dawn crept through the broken roof. He must have slept. He woke with a start, his neck stiff, the cabin cold. He looked at Eleanor. She was still, too still. "Eleanor," he whispered, his heart stopping. Her eyes flickered open. The fever was gone. They were clear, lucid, though shadowed with exhaustion. She looked at him. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He fumbled for the canteen, lifting her head gently so she could drink. "I heard you," she said after a moment. "In the night, I heard you." He could not speak. He just smoothed the damp hair from her forehead, his hand trembling. "I was always so afraid," she confessed, her voice paper thin. "My whole life, of being alone, the ranch, The money. I thought if I had those things, I would not be forgotten. Her eyes filled with tears. The marriage. It was never just about the land. It was, I did not want to die unloved. He leaned down, his own tears blurring his vision. You are not alone. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick. I am here. He kissed her forehead, a kiss of pure, reverent tenderness. He kissed her eyelids, and then, slowly, he kissed her lips. It was a kiss with no hunger, no desperation. It was a slow, deep vow of intimacy and protection. Rest, he whispered against her skin. I have you. She gave a small, shuddering sigh, a sound of release, of safety. She rested her head on his arm, her good hand gripping his shirt, and for the first time in her life, she slept, truly slept, knowing she was not alone. He sat there, stroking her hair until the sun was high in the sky. The journey back was a slow, agonizing crawl. Caleb rode with Eleanor cradled in front of him, her body limp, her fever-bright eyes barely registering the terrain. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the ranch compound below, a cheer went up from the vaqueros on the wall. Tomas rode out to meet them, his face a mask of terror that turned to grim resolve when he saw the blood-soaked bandage. Madre de Dios, he whispered, crossing himself. The cousins. One of them, Caleb said, his voice flat with exhaustion. He did not stop. He rode straight to the main house. Marta and the other women were waiting, their hands clasped to their mouths. Caleb swung down and lifted Eleanor from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. He carried her past the shocked faces, up the stairs, and into her bedroom, the room he had never been allowed to enter. He laid her on the high, soft bed, her black hair stark against the white pillows. Marta, he commanded, his voice filling the void of leadership. Boil water, clean bandages, whiskey, and send a man for the doctor, though God knows if he'll come. He will come, Tomas said from the doorway, his hand on his pistol. I will see to it. For a week, the ranch held its breath. Eleanor hovered between life and the fevered, grasping dark. Caleb did not leave her side. He sat in a high-backed chair by her bed, sleeping in 20-minute increments, his rifle leaning against the wall. He was the first thing she saw when her fever broke, his face haggard, his beard rough, his eyes red-rimmed. You stayed, she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. I am your husband, he replied, as if it were the only explanation needed. He brought a cup of water to her lips, his hand, scarred and calloused, impossibly gentle as it supported her head. During her recovery, the ranch shifted on its axis. The power vacuum she had left was filled, not by the vaqueros or the women, but by Caleb. When Tomas came with a question about the cattle, Caleb, not wanting to disturb Eleanor, met him on the porch. The south herd needs moving to the high pasture. Tomas said, Do it, Caleb said, and double the patrols on the north range. Send men in pairs. No one rides alone until we settle this. Si, patron. Tomas said. The word hung in the air. Patron. It was not a title given lightly. It was not a title the judge had ever earned. Caleb looked at the foreman, who met his gaze steadily. The trust was total. It had been earned in the barn, at the fence line, and in the canyon pass, when Eleanor was finally strong enough to sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets. She watched him. Caleb was no longer the drifter. He was a man with a purpose. He moved with authority, his voice low, his orders clear. He was discussing rotational grazing with the vaqueros, using his soldier's mind to organize the ranch's defenses, inspecting the ledgers with a keen eye. He was a natural leader, a man who had simply lacked a thing to lead. He had not taken her power. He had simply shouldered it while she healed. The town, however, saw things differently. The story of the ambush, of Eleanor's wound, of Caleb's lethal response had spread. But in the telling, it became twisted. The town, fueled by suspicion and malice, did not see a husband protecting his wife. They saw a violent drifter, a killer, cementing his control. They whispered that he had staged the attack himself to isolate her, to seize the ranch. The gossip grew, turning from hushed whispers to open speculation. On a Sunday, 3 weeks after their return, Eleanor insisted on riding into town. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed to show the town and her cousin's spies that she was not broken. She was pale, her arm still in a sling, but she sat her horse as straight as ever. Caleb rode beside her, his face a hard, watchful mask. As they rode down the main street, a silence fell. Storekeepers stopped sweeping. Men paused their conversations. The town was holding a collective, hostile breath. In the center of the street, on a makeshift pulpit of stacked crates, Reverend Blackwood was delivering his Sunday sermon to a small, huddled crowd. He saw them. He stopped, his eyes lighting with a divine, sulphurous fury. He raised a bony arm, his finger pointing directly at Eleanor. "Behold," he boomed, his voice echoing off the false fronts, "the testimony of your sin, made flesh, wounded by the violence she has invited, the Jezebel of the plains." Caleb's horse shifted, his hand moving to his reins. "Eleanor, we're leaving." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be run out." Blackwood, emboldened by her defiance, stepped down from his crates and advanced into the street. He was a prophet of his own righteous anger. "You have forsaken the decent folk of this town," he shouted, stopping directly in front of her horse, forcing it to backstep. "You have forsaken your God. You have allied yourself with a killer, a gray-coat devil, and consorted with the heathen Apache. You are a stain on this community." "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice a low warning, "step away from the horse." "I will not." Blackwood's face was purple, spittle flying from his lips. He was in a holy fervor. He reached up, his hand grabbing for Eleanor's reins. "Woman, repent, repent, before he drags your immortal soul to hell with his own." He was so consumed by his righteousness that he did not see Caleb dismount. It was not a hop or a step. It was a single, fluid motion. Caleb was on the ground, took one stride, and his fist connected with the preacher's jaw. It was not a brawl, it was a judgment. The sound was a sharp, solid crack. Reverend Blackwood's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled into the thick dust of the street, his sermon cut short. The town was in absolute, stunned silence. No one moved, no one even breathed. Caleb stood over the fallen preacher. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the man on the ground. "Keep my wife's name out of your mouth," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet. He turned, wiped the dust from his knuckles, and offered his hand to Eleanor. "Let's get the supplies," he said. She took his hand and let him help her down. They walked into the general store, the crowd parting before them as if they were lepers or royalty. The scandal was complete. They were no longer just outcasts. They were enemies of the town. When they returned to the ranch, laden with grain and salt, they found 2 fine buggies parked in the yard. Sheriff Brody was on the porch, twisting his hat in his hands. Thomas and a dozen vaqueros were standing in a silent, armed semicircle. Facing the porch, 2 men in expensive, dark Eastern suits stood by the door. They were in their 40s, with soft hands and arrogant, dismissive eyes. "Eleanor," the taller one said, with a thin smile, "you look unwell. The territories do not agree with you." "Arthur, Stephen," Eleanor said, her voice flat. She dismounted, Caleb beside her. "What are you doing on my land?" "That," said the other cousin, Stephen, "is precisely the point. It is not your land." A third man, a lawyer with a shiny briefcase, stepped forward. "Mrs. Vale, Mr. Hart. I am Mr. Fry, counsel for the Vale estate. We are here to serve this." He produced a document with an important-looking seal. "This is a new court order, issued by the circuit judge, based on the findings of land agent Fenton. The court has issued a writ of eviction. The North Range, and all its water rights, has been ruled public domain. You are, as of this moment. Trespassing. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Eleanor laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "You cannot be serious. A writ? Based on an allegation?" "It is quite serious," Arthur said, his smile widening. "The judge's fraud was extensive. The court was appalled. It has invalidated your entire claim." "You have no claim," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the legal talk. The cousins and their lawyer finally turned to him, as if noticing a piece of furniture that had spoken. "You must be the husband," Fry said, adjusting his spectacles. "This does not concern you." "It concerns him," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "And it concerns this." She nodded to Caleb. He reached into his shirt pocket and removed the folded, yellowed letter Chatto had given him. He handed it not to the lawyer, but to Sheriff Brody. Brody fumbled with it, unfolded it, and began to read. His face went from pale to ashen. "My God," he whispered. "What is that?" Fry demanded. Snatching the letter, he read it, his smug expression collapsing. The cousins read it over his shoulder, their faces darkening. "This is a confession," Caleb said, "from Judge Vale. It proves he stole the land, but it does not prove it is public domain. It proves he stole it from the Mescalero Apache, who hold prior title. Your claim, Mr. Fry, is as fraudulent as the judge's. You have no standing." Fry sputtered. This is inadmissible. It's a forgery." "It is the truth," Eleanor said. "And we have a witness to the ambush you ordered, the one that nearly killed me. The man Caleb killed on the pass. He worked for you, Arthur." The cousins looked genuinely shocked. "Ambush? We ordered no ambush. We are businessmen, not murderers." "You're hired men, then," Caleb said, his eyes hard. "It makes no difference. You came here with a faulty writ." "The writ stands," Fry insisted. Recovering, "This letter changes nothing today. It is a matter for the High Court. The circuit judge's order is law. Sheriff, evict these people." All eyes turned to Brody. He was sweating, trapped between the armed vaqueros and the men with the law. Caleb stepped in front of Eleanor. "This writ," he said to the lawyer, "has to be served by a federal marshal, not a county sheriff. You are on our land, attempting to enforce an invalid order. I am telling you to leave." "This is an outrage," Arthur shouted. "We will be back, with the marshal and the High Court in Dodge." "Then go," Caleb said. The cousins, their lawyer, and the visibly relieved Sheriff Brody scrambled into their buggies. As they rattled out of the gate, Eleanor sagged against Caleb. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They'll go to Dodge City. They'll see the territorial judge." "I know," Caleb said, his arms around her. "And we'll be there first." The ride to Dodge City was long and grueling. They left Tomas in charge, took their 2 best horses, the letter, and a heavy bag of ranch gold. Dodge was a different world. It was not a small, dusty outpost. It was the roaring, chaotic heart of the cattle trade. The streets were choked with cowboys, gamblers, and businessmen, the air thick with smoke, whiskey, and the bawl of 1,000 longhorns in the stockyards. The territorial courthouse was the largest brick building in town. They were told Judge Harlan was hearing cases. They waited 2 days, staying in a small, clean hotel, until they were granted a hearing. They walked into a high-ceilinged chamber. The Vale cousins and Mr. Fry were already there, looking confident. Judge Harlan was an old man with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen everything. Fry presented his case, the fraudulent title, the land reverting to public domain, the cousins' rightful claim. He painted Eleanor as incompetent and Caleb as a violent interloper. Then Eleanor rose. She did not speak with passion or anger. She spoke with cold, clear facts. She laid out her late husband's cruelty, her own stewardship of the ranch, and the cousins' predatory actions. And then she presented the Apache letter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "my cousins are correct about one thing. My late husband was a thief, but he did not steal from the public. He stole from the Mescalero Apache. Their claim predates the United States, let alone my cousin's greed. This letter is Judge Vale's own confession. The judge read the letter, his expression grim. Fry leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The Apache are savages. They have no standing, no title. They have the land. Mr. Fry," the judge said, his voice a low growl. "And this letter, this confession, is a powerful piece of evidence. It suggests that the land is not, in fact, public domain. It is contested territory, subject to treaty, and," he looked at the cousins, "the allegations of ambush and violence, attested to by Mr. Hart, are deeply troubling." He leaned back. "I will not grant your eviction. I will not rule on the title. I am placing a stay on the circuit court's writ, effective immediately. I am delaying any judgment on the North Range until I can review this evidence, consult with the federal Indian agents, and convene a full territorial hearing. This will take months." He slammed his gavel. "Delay is granted. This hearing is adjourned." Eleanor and Caleb walked out into the late afternoon sun, lightheaded with a victory that felt more like a ceasefire. They had won. They had time. They stood on the boardwalk, exhausted, dusty, and emotionally drained. The sun was setting, and the gas lamps of Dodge were flickering to life. From a large saloon and hall across the street, the sound of a fiddle and piano spilled out. A sign in the window, brightly painted, read, "Saturday night dance, all welcome." Caleb looked at Eleanor. She was still in her gray riding skirt, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her good arm dusty, her sling still visible under her jacket. She looked at the light, at the couples disappearing inside. "We should get a room," Caleb said. He saw the look on her face, a fleeting, girlish wistfulness she tried to hide. "And supper." He took her arm. He did not lead her to the hotel. He led her to a brightly lit dress shop, its windows filled with more finery than she had seen in 20 years. "Caleb, what are you doing?" "We're celebrating," he said. He pushed her gently inside, where a surprised shopkeeper looked up. "Get something," he said, pressing a roll of bills from the ranch gold into her hand. "Something not black, something bright." He waited in the hotel lobby, having washed and borrowed a clean shirt and string tie from the night clerk. He felt clumsy, his scars and his gun obvious in the polite lobby. Then she appeared at the top of the stairs. He stopped breathing. The dress was red, a deep, rich velvet red, the color of wine, the color of blood. It was cut modestly, but it clung to her. Her hair was not in its severe bun. She had taken it down and pinned it up loosely, soft tendrils framing her face. The sling was gone. She was not the Iron Widow. She was not the Patrona. She was a beautiful, nervous woman. She walked down the stairs, her hand on the railing. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice full of doubt. I feel foolish." He could not find words. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, stunned awe. He walked to the bottom of the stairs and simply offered her his arm. When they entered the dance hall, the music, a lively reel, sputtered and died. The entire room, cattle barons, dusty cowboys, painted ladies, townsfolk, turned to stare. They saw the beautiful, pale woman in the impossible red dress, and the scarred, dangerous-looking gunman at her side. Caleb did not care. He ignored them all. He led her to the center of the empty floor. The pianist, recovering, began to play a slow waltz. He put one hand on her waist. He took her gloved hand in his. They began to move, stiffly at first, then finding a rhythm. He was not a good dancer. She had not danced in 20 years. It did not matter. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an emotion he had never seen. She relaxed in his arms, resting her head against his shoulder. "I used to dream of this," she whispered, her voice thick, meant only for him. "When I was a girl, in Georgia, before I even knew the judge existed, I dreamed I would go to a real dance, and I would wear a red dress." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "And I dreamed that, just for one night, someone would look at me, that they would see me. Not my father's land, not the judge's money, not the ranch, just Eleanor." He stopped dancing. He pulled her closer, framing her face with his rough hands. The entire room was watching. He did not care. "I see you, Eleanor," he said, his voice raw. "God help me, you are all I see." He leaned down and kissed her. He kissed her in the middle of the dance floor, in front of the crowd, under the bright gas lamps. It was a kiss of absolute, public claiming. It was a kiss that said she was his, and he was hers, and the world could go to hell. No more hiding. When he finally broke the kiss, the hall was silent. Then, from the back, an old cattleman whistled and clapped. The music swelled, and the floor filled with other couples, leaving them in their own world. They walked back to the hotel, their hands clasped. The air between them was electric, thick with love, with the victory, with the shared fear and the promise of the night. He unlocked the door to their room. It was simple, lit by a single oil lamp. He locked the door behind them and turned to her. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He simply reached up, his fingers trembling, and began to unpin her hair, letting the dark mass fall over her shoulders, over the red velvet. "You are beautiful, Eleanor," he whispered. He traced the line of her jaw, his touch reverent. He unbuttoned the back of the dress, his movements slow, deliberate. This was not the desperate, angry fire of the study. It was not the raw, elemental need of the cave. This was a choice. This was slow, mutual, and consumed by a love that had finally, fully, taken root. The red dress slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet like a splash of wine. He knelt before her, his eyes on her face. He kissed the scar on her shoulder, the one the gunman's bullet had left. "I am so sorry I hurt you," he whispered against her skin. She threaded her fingers into his hair. "You did not hurt me," she replied. "You saved me." He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. He made her feel seen. He made her feel adored. He made her feel as if she were the only woman in the world, a thing to be worshipped. Every touch was a prayer, a mapping of her skin, a promise to protect, and she, in turn, held his face in her hands. She kissed the scar on his cheek. She kissed the old, faded scars on his chest. She kissed the rough, calloused knuckles of his hands. She made him feel worthy. She made him feel clean. She washed away the blood, the war, and the ghost of his brother. Their passion, this time, was not a firestorm. It was a deep, slow, powerful river, washing away the past, and leaving in its place only the two of them, a man and a woman. Finally, truly, home. The months it took for Judge Harlan's review to conclude were a strange, suspended time. The stay on the eviction meant the Vale cousins were powerless. But the threat remained. The disputed land, the North Range, existed in a legal limbo, belonging to everyone and no one. But on the ranch, life settled. It was the first true peace Caleb had known since before the war. He was no longer the drifter in the barn. He was the patron, the master of the house. He and Eleanor were inseparable. They ate their meals together, side by side at the long table. The 20 feet of polished wood that had once separated them now just a memory. They ran the ranch as a true partnership. He managed the men and the cattle, his strategic mind finally put to use protecting something he loved. She managed the books and the contracts, her sharp intelligence no longer a weapon of defense, but a tool of creation. They shared a bed. They shared their days. They shared the quiet, profound intimacy of two people who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to stay. The ghosts were still there. Jesse's face in Caleb's dreams, the judge's shadow in the house. But they were faint, their power broken by the light of the present. The ruling finally came by courier, not from Dodge, but from the territorial capital. It was, as Mr. Fenton had been, a compromise. The court, unwilling to tangle with Apache treaties but equally unwilling to reward the Vale cousins, had ruled partially. Eleanor's ownership of the main ranch, the house and the south pastures was affirmed, ironclad and final. Her marriage to Caleb Hart was recognized as legal and binding. But the disputed North Range, the 20,000 acres of water rights, was to remain in limbo. pending a full federal review which could take years. It was a victory, but a fractured one. "We keep the house," Eleanor said, the paper trembling in her hand. They were in the study. "We keep the ranch," Caleb corrected, his hand resting on her good shoulder. The wound had healed, leaving a puckered, silver scar that he kissed every night. "The North Range is just land. We can survive without it." "They will not see it that way," she said, her voice quiet. "They have been denied. A desperate man is a snake in the grass." She was right. The cousins, Arthur and Stephen, had been publicly humiliated. They had lost their legal battle. Their attempt at extortion had been exposed by the judge's own letter, and their claim was now worthless. They had returned to St. Louis, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unfinished, ugly energy. The desperation Eleanor had predicted arrived 3 weeks later. It came on a moonless, windless night in late summer. Caleb woke with a soldier's instinct. The air was wrong. It was not a sound that woke him, but a smell. The faint, acrid tang of kerosene, and, beneath it, the sharp, dry scent of burning grass. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and boots. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered, sitting up, clutching the sheet. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his rifle. "Lock the door." He ran onto the porch. The night was still, but the northern horizon was not black. It was a sick, flickering orange. A column of dark smoke, visible even in the night, was rising from the North Range. "Thomas!" Caleb roared, his voice a cannon shot in the dark. "Fuego! Fuego!" The ranch compound exploded. Bells clanged. Men spilled from the bunkhouse, pulling on boots, their faces grim. "It's the North Pasture!" Thomas yelled, already saddling horses. "By the hay stores." "It's moving fast." "The cousins," Caleb said, his voice flat. "They hired mercenaries. This isn't a warning. They mean to burn us to the bedrock." The fire, fed by the dry late summer grass and the kerosene, was not a simple line of flame. It was a wall, 20 feet high, roaring toward the main compound. The sound of it was a deafening, hollow rumble, like a freight train that would never pass. "Wagons," Caleb commanded, his mind military and clear. "Fill every barrel with water. Get the women, soak blankets. Tomas, you take 10 men and ride west. We need to start a backfire at the creek bed, or it will jump and take the south herd. I will take the rest. We try to hold it at the ridge." Men scattered, following orders without question. This was not a fire. It was a battle. Caleb swung onto his horse, the heat already blasting his face, the air filled with embers that stung his skin. He led his men into the inferno. They worked with desperate, frantic energy, beating at the flanks of the fire with wet blankets, trying to slow its spread, to channel it. But the wind, which had been still, now rose, awakened by the massive heat. It began to push the flames south, faster and faster. "It's too much," a vaquero shouted, his face black with soot, his eyebrows singed. "Patron, we cannot hold it." "Fall back to the creek," Caleb ordered, his throat raw from smoke. "We make our stand with Thomas." As he turned, he looked back toward the compound, which was now lit as bright as day by the horrifying orange glow, and his heart stopped. A single rider was galloping from the gates, not toward the safety of the south, but straight toward the fire line. It was Eleanor. She was riding her black mare, her hair flying loose, a rifle in her hand. She was not the widow. She was not the woman in the red dress. She was the patrona, a warrior queen riding out to defend her kingdom. "Eleanor!" He screamed, his voice ripped away by the roar of the flames. "Go back! Eleanor!" She either did not hear him or did not care. She was riding for the west flank, trying to reach Thomas, trying to help. She galloped into a low-lying pocket of smoke, a thick, swirling cloud that obscured the ground. Caleb spurred his horse, racing after her. "Eleanor!" He saw it happen. Her horse, blinded by the smoke and terrified by the sound, screamed. It reared, its eyes wide with panic. It must have stepped in a gopher hole, its legs snapping. The animal went down in a terrible, crashing fall. Eleanor was thrown, her body tumbling hard. She did not get up. She lay still, a small, dark shape on the ground, as the wall of fire, not 50 yards away, bore down on her. "No," Caleb whispered. The word was a prayer. He drove his horse into the smoke. The heat so intense it felt like his skin was peeling. His horse shied, fighting him, but he spurted onward, ruthless. Eleanor. He saw her. She was unconscious, a bloody gash on her temple where she had struck a rock. The air was unbreathable, a solid, toxic heat. He leaped from the saddle, his lungs seizing. He grabbed her, his hands hooking under her arms. She was a dead weight. He began to run, dragging her, his boots stumbling on the rough ground. He was blind, moving only on instinct, away from the heat that was scorching his back. He could hear the fire just behind him, a living, breathing monster, its roar filling his ears. He fell to his knees, his lungs burning, his vision graying out. He could not lift her. He would not leave her. He put his body over hers, shielding her from the falling embers, and waited for the end. A wall of water hit him. He looked up, gasping. Tomas and 4 vaqueros were there, their faces demonic in the firelight. They had brought the water wagon. They were soaking the ground, soaking him, creating a desperate, steaming barrier. "Patron! Grab her!" Tomas screamed. Hands seized him, seized Eleanor. They were thrown onto the back of the wagon, which was already turning. The men beat at the embers that had landed on their clothes as the horses plunged through the smoke, back toward the ranch. Caleb collapsed onto the wagon bed, pulling Eleanor into his arms. His body still covering hers. He was burned, exhausted, but he was alive, and she was breathing. When the dawn came, it revealed a wasteland. The entire North Range was a sea of black, smoking ash. The fire had been stopped, barely, at the creek bed, just yards from the main compound and the south pastures. The ranch was saved, but the disputed land was gone, sterilized by the inferno. They sat on the porch, Caleb and Eleanor, wrapped in blankets. His hands were blistered, his face streaked with soot. Her head was bandaged. They watched the sun rise over their scarred, ruined land. And then they came. The first was a small wagon, rattling up the road from town. It was Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, his face pale. He was followed by another wagon, and another. It was the townspeople. They came, not with accusations, but with wagons full of supplies, food from the general store, barrels of water, bandages and salve from the doctor. Men from town, men who had averted their eyes just weeks before, got out, holding shovels and axes. They stood in the yard, looking at the devastation. Then at the couple on the porch, they saw Eleanor, not as the Jezebel, but as a woman who had nearly died protecting her home. They saw Caleb, not as a killer, but as the man who had led the fight and saved the valley from a fire that could have destroyed them all. Silas Croft, the rancher who had started the fight in the saloon, was there. He walked slowly up to the porch, his hat in his hands. He looked at Caleb, then at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice rough. "Mr. Hart, we saw the glow. We reckoned it was the cousins. What they done. It's not right. It's not our way. This ranch, it's part of this valley. Your fight, it's ours too. We brought supplies, and my men are ready to help rebuild the fences." Eleanor looked at him, speechless. A woman stepped forward, one of the town widows Eleanor had often seen in church, a woman named Mrs. Gable. "Ma'am," she said, her voice trembling. "What that reverend said. It was a disgrace. We were wrong. We let our fear and gossip blind us." She took a deep breath. "My late husband, he used to handle papers for the judge. I heard things. I never said nothing, but I'll testify. If you need me to, I'll go to Dodge. I'll tell them what I know about the judge's dealings." Eleanor looked at the faces in her yard. They were no longer a jury. They were neighbors. Tears streamed down her soot-stained cheeks, washing clean tracks in the grime. Caleb stood, pulling her up with him. He put his arm, blistered and raw, around her waist. A few weeks later, at a town hall meeting in Cedar Bluff, the mood was not one of condemnation, but of rebuilding. It was Caleb who spoke, his voice filling the hall, his words simple and direct. "The Vale cousins tried to burn us out," he said, standing beside Eleanor, his hands resting on the table. "They failed. They did not just attack this ranch. They attacked this valley. They attacked all of you." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the ranchers, the merchants, the widows. "Eleanor and I, we are not leaving. The court in Dodge can take its time. The land is in limbo, but we are not. This is our home. This is our ranch. And anyone, from St. Louis or anywhere else, who tries to take it, they will have to answer to all of us." A rancher in the back stood up. "He's right. You tell us what you need. Heart, you'll have it." Months passed. The long, hard winter came, and the ranch survived on the feed from the south pastures and the grace of its new neighbors. The Vale cousins, facing a territorial investigation for arson, never returned. Spring came, and with it, a miracle. The land, which had been black and dead, began to show new life. Tiny, vibrant green shoots pushed up through the ash. The North Range was healing. The grass was regrowing. One morning, just at dawn, Caleb and Eleanor rode out. It was the first time they had been back to the North Range since the fire. The air was cool and clean, and the rising sun illuminated a land carpeted in new, fragile green. They stopped their horses on the same ridge where she had told him the truth about the judge. The world was quiet, washed clean. She turned to him in her saddle, a soft, peaceful smile on her face. "Do you remember?" she asked. "How I told you I was so afraid, of being forgotten, of dying alone and unloved?" "I remember," he said. "I do not feel that way anymore," she said, her voice quiet. "I could lose all of this tomorrow. The land, the house. It could all burn again, and it would not matter. I would not be forgotten, because you would remember me." He reached out, his rough hand covering hers on the reins. He looked at the vast, healing land, the home he had fought for. He thought of his brother, Jesse, of the long, empty years of running, of the cold cot in the barn, of the man who had stepped into the Cedar Bluff saloon with no purpose. "When I came here," he said, his voice thick, "I told you I was looking for peace or death. Whichever came first, I was just waiting to die." He turned to her, his eyes clear. The old ghosts finally laid to rest. "I am not waiting anymore. Eleanor." She leaned in, and he met her halfway. They kissed under the vast, open sky, the sun rising at their backs. It was a kiss of profound, quiet gratitude. He pulled back, and she rested her head against his chest, right over his heart. Behind them, in the valley, the Vale Ranch, their ranch, was bustling with the sounds of a new morning, the sounds of life. Eleanor closed her eyes, her hand spreading flat over his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat beneath her palm. "You're not just my husband," she whispered. "You're my home." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this. We welcome all your thoughts and feedback in English.